Chapter 12. How was I supposed to know it was part of the plan? Christopher's voice was strained. I thought you meant it. Nicodemus was gentle. Do you really think we'd put you into exile? I didn't know, but I did know I should have told you about them. Yes, you should have. I wanted the secret for myself, and I knew you'd say not to go near them anymore. That's probably true. Arthur needed me. He was sick and half starved. Yes. Nicodemus looked at Christopher attentively, then shifted slightly in his chair. They were in his office, a small room with a wooden desk, chairs, and bookcase. Having the children here present difficulties, he said. There's a lot they don't know, but what they've seen and heard is dangerous for us. It would have been better to be avoided. You're angry. No. The old rat shook his head. His voice was stern, but he looked at Christopher fondly. It's just that I haven't been feeling well, and the trip up and down the mountain was tiring. I'm never tired, Christopher said. Only hungry. Yes, said Nicodemus, smiling. I've noticed. And he dismissed Christopher with a wave of his paw. Raxo had agreed to babysit Arthur while Christopher was talking with Nicodemus. In fact, he had looked forward to the opportunity. There were many things about city life that he missed, and he was hoping Arthur could give him an update. The boy was sitting cross-legged by the creek, eating raisins one by one. Raxo sat on his haunches in front of him. I was just wondering how things are going in the candy industry, he said brightly. Candy is my favorite food, and we don't get much of it here. Arthur was pleased but confused. He liked candy too. His mother had been in the habit of buying him a candy bar every time she went to the grocery store. He could picture the wrapper clearly in his mind. He licked his lips and looked at Raxo, but Raxo didn't give him any candy. He just kept talking. One of my favorites is the peppermint patty, he told Arthur confidingly. When I had a chance, I always got that first, especially if it was a hot day. I think peppermint tastes so good on a hot day. And when I came to Thorn Valley, that's here, you know. That's what it's called here. I discovered they didn't have any candy. I really felt sorry for them. So I worked and worked, and I made them a whole bunch for a surprise. To be honest with you, Isabella helped too. Christopher was real sick then, but we snuck in and gave him some anyway. And he loved it. It helped him get well, and everyone else loved it too. Raxo sighed. It's mostly gone now. I've been wanting to make some more, but I've just been so busy. Arthur kept thinking that Raxo was going to give him some candy, even though Raxo hadn't said so. He checked to see if Raxo had pockets where a candy bar might be hidden, but he didn't. He wondered if Raxo had any money. To get candy, you had to have money, but Raxo didn't have pockets to put the money in. What's your favorite kind of candy? Raxo asked. Arthur didn't answer. Don't be shy, Raxo said. You don't have to be shy with me. I know what humans are like. I come from the city myself. Some of these other rats don't know about the kind of stuff that you and I know about, because they've always lived here in the valley. They live the natural way. No TV, no comics. I like it here now, but it does take some getting used to. Sometimes I sit and remember the store I used to sneak into at night. It was just one room, and across the front, there was a great big counter. And along the counter, there was every kind of candy bar in the whole world. And they were lined up according to color. First, there were the Hershey bars, which are brown. Then, next to them, were the plain M&Ms. And next to them were the Tootsie Rolls. Then, The Reds, Mounds bars, Kit Kat. I didn't like Kit Kat because it had the word cat in it, so I wouldn't eat that. Anyway, there were Nestle's Crunch, Norman Joy, because they're blue, and suddenly Raxo realized that Arthur was crying. He'd been so carried away by his memories that he'd almost forgotten about the boy. What's wrong? What's the matter? He asked. Arthur opened his mouth and moaned. He wanted candy. In his mind, he thought the words, want candy. He opened his mouth and moaned again. Wouldn't you know that Christopher would arrive right then? Raxo was mortified. What have you done to him? Christopher shouted. He's crying. I know he's crying. You were supposed to be taking care of him. I was taking care of him. Raxo was exasperated. I was just talking to him about some things we have in common. And when you looked up, you shouldn't have looked away in the first place. Pardon me, Raxo said, but look at him right now. Arthur had stopped crying and was smiling instead, smiling at the antics of Seymour and Michelina, who were wrestling with each other in a puddle of dust. Their tails whipped back and forth, and they tumbled over and over, screeching, ee. Arthur laughed out loud. He had forgotten about the candy. Christopher said. I guess he's okay after all. Guess so. I'm going to take him for a walk. Want to come? No, thanks. Raxo went back to the laboratory, still dreaming about the candy bars, while Christopher and Arthur strolled up the walk from the pine grove to the back door of the nest. Christopher brought the things he wanted to show Arthur outside one by one. This is my bowl. See how it's got my name carved on it? And this is the journal I keep for school. I write down my ideas in here and all the exciting things that happen. I wrote about you too. And this is a jar of pokeberry ink. We use it to write. Never drink this. It's poisonous. Last year I wanted to see how poisonous it was, so I mixed some with water and drank just a little bit. Was I sick? Christopher laughed. And this is a game you play with sticks and balls. See, you hold this stick with your tail, if you have one, that is, and you whack the ball into the basket. Christopher demonstrated how this was done. He chased the ball around in circles until he was panting, then went over to the bamboo faucet near the nest and turned it on to get a drink. Arthur got down on his knees and got a drink too. He liked the little piece of wood that switched the faucet on and off. Now we'll go for a walk, Christopher said. They strolled beside the stream. Christopher chatted happily, telling Arthur about how he'd met Raxo and how they became friends. We got assigned to work in the garden together while some of the other rats were away. Neither of us would admit we couldn't read the list of instructions, so we ended up picking all the mint instead of weeding it. But that wasn't the first time I'd gotten in trouble. Not at all. When I was really little, I used to eat in the nursery. They always brought in soup first, then bread. One day I decided to have my bread first. By the time I got to the soup, it was cold. So I found there was a good reason to eat soup first, but I had to figure it out for myself. That's how I am about everything. I'm always trying new things, like walking backward instead of head first, and sleeping in the daytime but staying up all night. Just do what I tell you, my dad says, and my mom says, Christopher, why can't you trust our experience? But it isn't that I don't trust them, Artie. I just like to see for myself. There are lots of ways to do things. I learned that from Raxo. He came here from the city, like you, and he had been brought up differently. He taught me about rock and roll music and tall buildings and cars and junk food and TV. In school, I learned that the earth's covered with many cities and countries, and they all have different ways of doing things. That's why I get impatient, doing the chores the same way each time. Nicodemus says I have to do them anyway. He says I have to figure out a way to keep from getting bored so quick. But I could never be bored around you, Audie. Everything about you is interesting. Someday you'll tell me all about yourself, about your mom and dad, and what your house is like, and what you like to play with. One day, when you feel like it. Arthur wished he could tell Christopher about his home, but as usual, the words stuck in his throat. His bowl didn't have his name on it, like Christopher's, but it did have a picture of a dump truck in the middle. If you finished your cereal, you could see it. And he had games too, just like Christopher. A box where you stuck different shapes in different holes, and a clown that popped back up when you knocked him over. You haven't gone sick since that day by the cave, Christopher said gently. That was true. Arthur had drunk a dose of the medicine this morning, though, and Raxo thought he should have 2 more doses, whether he got sick or not. This medicine was special because Raxo had helped invent it. It came from plants that grew by the pond and in a special part of the garden. They had been ground up and mixed together. Raxo said when you drank it, part of the valley went inside you. Arthur had had lots of medicines before, pills and shots and sprays and spoonfuls of gooky stuff, but none of the doctors had been like Raxo. You could pat Raxo. Christopher went down a bank to a sand beach beside the creek and drank. He splashed water with his tail. Arthur sat down and pulled his sneakers off. The water felt nice. He saw his reflection. His face looked bigger than he remembered, and it was smiling. He knocked a hole in it, laughing. Christopher laughed too. Arthur waded into the stream. He squatted down and let the water run through the seat of his pants and splashed his chest. He was taking a bath, but there was no soap. He laughed again. Later, they lay on the beach and let the sun dry them. Arthur fell asleep on the warm sand. When he woke up, there were blackberries and bread to eat. The warm breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle and wild roses. There's just one more thing I want to show you, Christopher said on the way home. He took Arthur to a knoll where an oak tree grew. Pulling back the vines at the base of the trunk, he showed him how the soft ground underneath formed a hollow spot, like a pocket. This is a secret place, Christopher explained. I found it when I was little. I've never told anyone else about it, not till now. It's going to be for us. He paused to let the effect of this sink in. I might leave a present here for you, or a message, or something special to eat, and you might leave something here for me. But we won't tell anyone. That's what secret means, you know. Arthur nodded. And we'll pledge to keep it a secret because we're such good friends. They do that in stories. Let's see. The pledge will go like this. Christopher talked for a while about the brotherhood of rat and child, using phrases like by my troth and sacred honor, and heretofore, theretofore, and in eternity. Arthur couldn't understand what he was saying, but he knew he could keep a secret. After all, he'd kept a secret from his parents and Margaret. It was in his closet. And we do so swear, Christopher said. Put your hand here, Audie, and I'll raise my paw. That's right. The rat made sure they were just touching. And we do thusly swear, he ended solemnly, our pledge shall live forever, and our friendship abide into eternity. Chapter 13. Isabella wasn't exactly ashamed of the way she treated Margaret, but she had a feeling it wasn't going to sound good after what the girl had accomplished. So when she saw Margaret coming down the cliff, holding on to the rope and balancing against the rock wall with her feet, Isabella decided to be civil. She found this manageable if she didn't look right at Margaret. For example, she said, "Congratulations." while staring at the top of a long needled fir tree. And I didn't think you could do it, with her eyes fixed on her own toenails. Then she glanced at Margaret out of the corner of one eye. You're bleeding, she screamed. Oh my gosh, you're bleeding. That's blood. Of course it's blood, Margaret said. I scraped myself on the rocks. But you need bandages, medicine, first aid, help. Isabella had never been good at dealing with injuries. If she cut herself in the kitchen, she always sent for Raxo to put on the band-aid. Looking at the blood was just too upsetting. But Raxo wasn't here now. Margaret rolled up the legs of her jeans. Her knees were raw. When she bent them, blood trickled down her calves. She gulped. She felt like she was going to throw up, and then suddenly she did. Isabella screamed and closed her eyes. Help, Raxo, she begged, but there was no reply. She wasn't sure later what made her think of the new image, the Isabella who was steady, strong, and resourceful, but gradually she managed to calm herself. She took deep breaths and thought. What would Nicodemus do now? Justin, Beatrice, Elvira, and suddenly she knew. She remembered a day when they'd been on a picnic, and a baby rat had cut his leg on a sharp stone. Elvira had directed the others to pick comfrey along the banks of the creek. They had dipped it into the water and made a poultice, wrapping strands of the herb around the wound. And she could recognize comfrey because they sometimes put it in the salad at dinner. Wait right here, she shouted at Margaret. I know what to do. Just lie down and wait for me. And Isabella raced off toward the stream. Later, Margaret had to agree that it really helped. The cool green stuff reminded her of seaweed. The scrapes on her elbows, wrists, and knees stopped burning, so that before long she could walk without wincing. Isabella was different this time, slow, considerate, stopping often to explain where they were. Carrying the nest was awkward, but it did fit in a forked branch in the oak tree. The walk back was like a dream for Margaret. She had never been so tired in her life, and as soon as she got to the glade where she'd left Arthur and Christopher, she lay down on the moss by the stream and fell asleep. She moved the nest! This cry entered Margaret's dream and repeated itself over and over. The voice that uttered it was high and shrill, Isabella's, but the repetition was odd, as if there were 100 rats echoing the news. Margaret was dimly aware of someone replacing the poultices on her arms and legs, but the voice that accompanied the soothing sensation seemed to be one she hadn't heard before. She was aware of a background hubbub, like static on the telephone, and she felt she could sense the presence of many small bodies around her. She reached out once in her sleep to see if she could touch them, but there was nothing there. By the time she awoke, there was only Arthur, sitting cross-legged on the ground with Christopher beside him. We heard you moved the hawk's nest, Christopher said. He felt as if he should thank Margaret, but he couldn't bring himself to. She nodded. It was scary, but I liked it. Why? Nobody ever asked me to do anything that important or that hard. She looked at Christopher awkwardly. I'm sorry about what happened in the cave. I was afraid. I didn't know what to do. I guess it wasn't that bad an idea, from your point of view, Christopher said ruefully. He rubbed the sore spot on his nose. Anyway, it worked out all right. She nodded. You know, I think I like it here, she said softly. She looked at her little brother. I think Artie does too. But she likes it here, Christopher said. She told me she did. He was standing in Nicodemus's office with Raxo and Justin. Nicodemus was sitting at his desk. And furthermore, she can keep on helping us, like she did with the hawk's nest. Think how fast she could move that pile of stones down by the dam. But then she would know about the dam. What does it matter if she knows? She knows a lot already. What do you mean? She knows we can talk and read and write. Justin shot a significant glance at Christopher, who winced. Will it really make any difference if she learns there are more of us than she thought? I see what you mean, Nicodemus said slowly. It wouldn't make her story any more believable, as long as they don't know about Nim, that is. What story? The one she tells when she gets back, where she came from. Oh, she can't go back. That would be crazy. Did you think she and Arthur would stay here forever? Nicodemus asked Christopher. Christopher hadn't really thought about that. He didn't know what to say. I don't think they'd be happy here, Nicodemus said softly. They'd miss their parents and friends. They're happy now, Christopher argued. Artie hasn't been sick at all, and he needs me. I'm his best friend. Having a special friend makes you feel special too, I bet. Christopher's throat tightened. Everybody else had someone. Raxo had Isabella, and Justin had Beatrice. Arthur needs me, he repeated. He can't talk, but I can understand him by the way he looks at me. I'm glad it was you who found him, Nicodemus said. Christopher brightened. He can stay, can't he? I don't know what's going to happen, but for now, I think you should look after him. Make sure he's comfortable and that he has whatever he needs to eat or play with. I will, Christopher smiled widely. Oh, I will. Normally, Margaret didn't like parties, but when Christopher said this one was in her honor, she could hardly refuse to come. And he'd said something about more rats, too. But this, during the evening, Margaret tried to count them, but they came and went so quickly that she couldn't get an accurate number. Raxo and Christopher were there, of course, and Isabella and Nicodemus, too. But besides them, there were others, light and dark, big and small, shy and friendly. She couldn't keep from enjoying herself. There was music, and everyone sang Froggy Went A-Courting and Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Then Raxo climbed up on a stump and crooned, Climb Every Mountain, which he dedicated to Margaret and Isabella. He also sang Love Me Tender and You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog, which all the rats seemed to like. Many of them danced, swaying on their haunches and swinging their tails back and forth. Margaret felt funny, being so big, but to her astonishment, Arthur jumped up and danced. He pumped his arms back and forth and let his head roll across his shoulders, and at the end of each song, he spun around in circles until he fell down. Then he crawled over and helped himself to the wooden trays loaded with raisin cookies and peaches and nuts and grape juice and raspberry tarts. Margaret loved the tarts, too. She ate a whole trayful, popping them into her mouth 2 at a time. Then she looked down, and Nicodemus was at her side. Congratulations, and thank you. Oh, Margaret felt embarrassed. Maybe I should thank you, she said weakly. I never would have done it if you hadn't made me. I made you try, but you succeeded all on your own, and it was a very hard task. You thought I could do it all along, didn't you? She stared at the old rat sitting so peacefully beside her. How had he known that about her? Yes, I did. He met her gaze gravely. I thought you could do it because you'd already done such wonderful things. She couldn't believe her ears. Was he talking about her, Margaret? What do you mean? She asked. You saved your brother's life, you found him food and shelter, and you captured Christopher and figured out a plan to get you and Arthur back home. You mean holding him hostage? He nodded, then smiled. I'm not suggesting that I approve of the plan, but under the circumstances it was resourceful. I wouldn't have hurt him, really. Margaret would have liked to say that she wasn't really wonderful at all. Suddenly she remembered the morning in the principal's office when she and Leon had been late, and she'd made up the story about how an old lady in a blue Buick had tried to kidnap them. The principal hadn't really believed her, but he'd let them into class without a note, and that was all she'd cared about anyway. She wouldn't have told that lie to Nicodemus. Nicodemus got to his feet. I've got to go. I told Beatrice I'd dance with her. I'll see you later. Okay. Margaret watched the dancing, letting her head sway with the rhythms of the music. She felt full inside, but the fullness wasn't just food. What is it? She asked herself, and the answer came back. I'm happy. After that, she did dance, first with Raxo, then with Isabella, and finally with Christopher. She showed them the break-dancing steps Leon had taught her. When she got down on the ground, Christopher jumped on her back and started dancing on top of her, spinning and whirling while she did the same thing underneath him. Raxo tried it then, but he ended up flipped on his back with all four legs treading the air at once. Like this, Margaret showed him how she used her forearms to pivot on. She felt great. She wasn't a good breakdancer, but nobody knew the difference. They called out, go, 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 and she danced faster and better than she ever had. After a while, Arthur got tired of dancing. He watched Margaret for a few minutes, but then he wandered away. The air was full of lightning bugs, and a big orange moon hung over the side of the mountain. He decided to take a walk. He walked until he came to the secret place. The branches of the great oak formed a roof under the sky. For a while he sat underneath the tree, leaning his small back against its trunk. He said aloud the word he had spoken when he thought Margaret was going to hurt Christopher. He said it loud, then softly, then as a question. No. The spoken words seemed like bubbles, delicate, magical, floating in the air until they finally sailed away. He got up and pulled away the vines as Christopher had shown him. He bent close to the smooth hollow and found a feather there, a present from his friend. He rubbed the soft edge against his cheek. He decided to carry it with him on his walk. After a time, he came to the bamboo faucet where Christopher had gotten a drink. He pulled the little piece of wood up. The water came on. He drank and then took off his shoes and wet his feet. He could hear the music coming from the clearing near the stream. He danced for a while. The ground under the faucet turned sticky with mud. He stuck his feet in the warm, oozy mud. The water formed a little river, rolling down toward the hole where Christopher had come and gone, bringing the bowl, the journal, the game. Arthur put his arm in the hole. He felt smooth, cool earth, nothing more. He went back to the mud and picked some up in his hands. You could mold it into shapes, like Play-Doh. He touched it to his lips, then spit it out. There was more and more mud, and when he jumped in the mud, water splashed everywhere. Chapter 14. Justin didn't go to the party. He had a headache, probably from trying to figure out how to handle the situation with the human children. He went to bed early, nestling into his mattress of dried grass, and was instantly asleep. He woke up under strange circumstances. It was not morning, he was sure of that. The sky was still dark through the window, and far off he could hear strains of music. The party. He glanced around the room. Everything was in its place. He closed his eyes again, almost drifted off, and then opened them. There was a strange smell in the air, a dank, wet smell. He opened his door and then slammed it shut, staring at a stream of water spreading across the floor. He grabbed a bit of wood and flung the door open again. The water in the hall was at least 4 inches deep. Holding the wood in one forepaw to help him float, he half scrambled, half swam for the main door. The current was with him. That meant the flood must be coming from the rear entrance. He breathed deep, swam harder. The water picked him up and deposited him with a splosh on the ground outside. Should he run for help or check the source? On a hunch, he ran round to the rear. A muddy pond was draining into the open door of the nest, and the faucet was still running. The human child, covered in mud, lay sound asleep on the clay rise just above the door. "Turn off the faucet!" Justin yelled. The child didn't stir. Justin plunged into the pond, keeping his head above the swill. He reached the water pipe and turned it off with his teeth. "What do you mean it didn't do that much damage?" Justin glared at Christopher. "It could have collapsed the lower section of the nest. If I hadn't stayed home from the party, we could have lost everything." "Not only that, but all the flour in the storeroom was turned to paste." Isabella was distraught. "We were saving it for winter. I don't know what we'll do now." "There's time to harvest more," Beatrice said, "and we can always make the acorn flour." "He didn't know what he was doing," Christopher said. "It's not fair to blame him." "I'm not blaming him," said Justin. "I'm blaming you. I thought you'd agreed to keep an eye on him. You let him wander away, and look what happened." "Maybe we could put a collar on him," Raxo suggested. "Humans do that for dogs and cats, you know." "Shut up, he's not a pet. I was just trying to help." You're trying," Nicodemus interrupted. "The truth is, this isn't a good place for a human child. The boy will have to be watched carefully so he doesn't do more damage." He turned abruptly and went back to his office. Margaret felt bad about the flood. She tried to make up for it by working extra hard. She helped the rats build their new dam, moving a great pile of stones and then placing them one by one in the clay mortar. She dug trenches for the irrigation system with a wooden spade carved especially for her. She learned to recognize most of the rats by name: Raxo, Justin, Beatrice, Brendan, Sally, Brutus, Nolan, Mitchell, Fern. They seemed like friends now. At the end of a long day, it was hard to remember everything they'd talked about. There were jokes and teasing, chatter about the progress of the work, how hot it was, what Isabella was cooking for dinner. Out of habit, the rats scanned the sky for the hawk, but it didn't reappear. Margaret learned more about them. But when she asked where they'd come from and how they'd ended up in the valley, they changed the subject or pretended they hadn't heard. Sometimes Margaret got angry. The work was hard. Her fingernails broke and her hands were covered with small cuts. Raxo gave her medicine to rub on the raw places. Still, some days she felt like a slave. "You can't make me work," she'd shout at the others. "I can do whatever I want to. I don't have to help you." "I didn't say you did," someone responded. Margaret stalked away and sat by herself under a pine tree. Still, When supper was dished up that evening, she felt a little funny about asking for seconds, and the next day she went back to work. She lost count of the days. Her sweatshirt grew grimy and ragged. She tried washing it, but without soap the water didn't make much difference. The reflection of her face in the pond looked thinner, and the waistband of her jeans got so loose that she had to hold it up with a belt made of vines. Sometimes the rat's food was good, other times awful. The worst was a paste of acorns, carrots, and onions. She'd seen fish in the pond and had asked the rats about fishing, but Isabella explained that they didn't kill animals for food, especially since there was plenty to eat otherwise. So acorns it was. With the help of the rats, Margaret built a hut out of saplings for her and Arthur to sleep in. It was a round house, like a bubble, at the base of a large straight pine. She wove leafy vines through the saplings to make the walls and roof. Isabella showed her how to braid wild grasses from the meadow, and these they tied over the vines on the top to keep out the rain. The floor was thick and soft from layers of pine needles. Margaret and Arthur slept in the hut every night. In the morning she waited for Christopher to come play with Arthur before she left for the day's work. She thought about home. The funny thing was that it seemed like a dream now. The fact that all her life she had lived in a brick house and slept in a bed with sheets, eaten her food off a china plate, worn clean clothes, spent the evenings eating candy or potato chips and watching TV. She thought about how different it was back there when she got a drink of water, how she'd looked in the cupboard or the dishwasher for a clean glass, turn on the faucet, watched the water flow out from the pipes that ran under the streets of the city. Then she'd put the dirty glass in the sink. Now when she was thirsty, she would walk down to the stream, cup some water into her hand, and drink it. It wasn't that one way was better or worse, but they were so different. There were some things at home that were better, though. One was mosquito repellent. Raxo had tried to develop some for her, but most mornings both she and Arthur crawled out of the hut covered with pink and white bumps. She gave up trying not to scratch them. The next days would itch worse, and then she would scratch them, and the old ones would disappear. She still talked to Leon in her mind. She wondered if he'd gotten the skateboard he wanted for his birthday. She wondered if he thought about her. He would miss her, she guessed. She wondered whether he'd been able to save $50 to buy a scooter. He'd bet her that he'd have all the money by the end of the summer. Now she didn't know when that was. In her mind, she asked him if he'd saved any, but it was like talking to a ghost. She tried not to think about her parents. When she imagined their faces, looking happy or sad or thoughtful, she got an awful feeling inside, sort of like sickness, but heavier and sadder. She remembered how her dad had forced her to go on the camping trip so she'd have a chance to be outdoors and away from the city. She'd resented it, of course, but when she smelled the wildflowers in the meadow or walked under the starry sky, she wished he could be with her. How he would have loved the valley. But he was far away. He didn't even know where she was, or that she'd changed. She missed her mother, too. She could picture her pale face and carefully set blonde hair perfectly. The image would come to mind when she was least expecting it, at dinner with the rats, or walking in the woods at night. When it came, she would feel like crying out, as if someone had hit her. That was strange, because back in the city, if there had been anyone from whom Margaret wanted to escape, it was her mother. Her mom had spent so much time trying to change the way she dressed, the way she spoke, the way she acted. Just leave me alone, Margaret used to shout, and then she'd slam the door to her bedroom as hard as she could. But there were other things about her mom, Margaret couldn't forget. Like the time her mom had spent all day trying to find just exactly the kind of day-glow wallpaper Margaret wanted for her bedroom, and had found it, and been almost as pleased as Margaret herself. Like the time she'd had Margaret's birthday party at the mall and let all the kids have as many hamburgers and shakes as they wanted. Like the time Margaret and Leon were the only kids who weren't invited to Eleanor Hoover's party, and her mom had taken them to hear the Purple Maniacs instead. Margaret wondered what she was doing right now. Maybe she was in the kitchen, listening to classical music on the radio, her hands deep in a ball of bread dough. Maybe she was sketching. Her drawings of Margaret and Archie were hanging in the living room. They were good, too. But probably she was worrying about the kids. She'd always worried some, but this was probably the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Margaret wished there was a way to let her know that they were okay. Once, when she'd been alone, she'd even shouted, "We're all right," just as loud as she could, over and over. But the words echoed back from the mountainside. She talked about home with the rats, too. Christopher, especially, was curious, but all the rest liked to hear stories about Margaret's life. "What do you do when school's out?" someone asked. "Do you play all day?" "I have to set the table and take out the trash, but after that I can do whatever I want. Usually Leon and I do stuff together. Most days in the summer, we take the bus downtown to his grandmother's house. She's this little black lady, about 1,000,000 years old, and she lets us do things our parents would kill us for." "Like what?" "Like eat a gallon of ice cream all at once, or dress up in the old clothes in her attic and wear them in the high rise next door. Her attic is full of neat stuff, old science magazines and an old microscope and a wind-up phonograph. She's got 6 cats too, and a chihuahua." "What's a chihuahua?" "It's a little dog, not much bigger than you. He's named Pedro." Margaret laughed out loud, remembering their adventures. "Once we crawled up on the roof and made a whole bunch of paper airplanes. We wrote crazy notes in them and threw them down at people who were walking by." "Did you get into trouble?" Margaret shook her head. "Somebody did go and complain, but you know what Leon's gram said? She said, 'I'm too old to worry about stuffed up people like you. You ought to learn how to laugh. Then you wouldn't have to come banging on an old woman's door.'" Margaret talked in a high voice. Then she called, "You children, come and have some cake." "What kind of cake?" Roxa's mouth watered. "Coconut. That's Leon's favorite." "Do coconuts grow here in the valley?" Little Michelina looked as if she were about to run into the woods and try to find one. Margaret and Roxa laughed. "They grow in Hawaii," Margaret explained. "They're big and white and waxy, not like walnuts or hazelnuts." "And they use them in candy, like Mounds bars." Roxa was proud of his special knowledge. "They're delicious." "I want to go to the city," Michelina whined. "Thorn Valley's no fun." "I love the valley." Margaret didn't plan the words. They just popped out. The scent of pine wafted from the fir trees overhead. "You do?" Michelina looked surprised. Margaret nodded, but she was surprised too. She hadn't known she loved anything. Oh.